Good morning. My name is Alan Briggs. I am the president of Bald Head Association. Seated here with me today, or by Zoom, are the additional 5 members of our board: John Kenny, our vice president; Robert Drumheller, our secretary-treasurer; Tiffany Williams, Jennifer Lucas, and Joe Bronner, our at-large members. Additionally, with us is Carrie Moffett, our executive director; Carol Collins, our administrative associate; and Pam Henson, our communications associate. The single most important issue on Bald Head Island for the last 2 years has been our ferry transportation system. The Mitchell family, the founding family for our island, has been seeking to sell the remaining assets of Bald Head Island Limited in order to complete the liquidation of the estates of George and Cynthia Mitchell. The ferry transportation system is the primary remaining asset. To accomplish this liquidation, in May of this year, BHA Limited entered into a contract with Sharpview Capital Limited out of Raleigh for sale of those ferry transportation assets to Sharpview. On July 14th of this year, Bald Head Island Limited and Sharpview applied to the North Carolina Utilities Commission for permission to transfer the common carrier certificate for the ferry and tram portion of the ferry transportation system from Bald Head Island Limited to Sharpview. The purpose of this meeting today is to provide factual information to the approximately 1,900 members of Bald Head Association regarding this transaction. This information will assist our members in making an informed decision as to the merits of this transaction. We, the board, invited the principal players relating to this transaction to come today and inform us of these facts. I am delighted they all accepted our invitations and are seated here today up front. I appreciate it. First, let me ask everyone to silence their cell phones. This event is being live streamed through Bald Head Association's YouTube channel and is being recorded. The video of the meeting will be posted on our YouTube channel within 24 hours. After our guests have made their presentations, board members will have a chance to ask questions of our speakers. Afterwards, members will have the opportunity to ask their questions. We ask that you hold your questions or comments until that time. For those who are attending in person, we'll invite you to the podium where we have a microphone set up so those who are connecting remotely can hear you. For those who have questions but cannot attend in person, email your questions to be asked at the meeting to Carrie Moffett at Carrie@baldheadassociation.com by 11 a.m., and we'll work to get all of the questions answered today as well. Note that duplicate questions may be grouped by topic, and questions will be asked as time allows. Let me now introduce our speakers, our initial 2 speakers, and I've kind of split it up so that Chad Paul and Lee Roberts could speak first, and thereafter the village and Susan, and it's not the village, it's our honorable mayor will be speaking for the village. But first let me introduce Chad Paul and Lee Roberts. Chad Paul is the Chief Executive Officer of Bald Head Island Limited. Mr. Paul graduated from Holy Cross University for undergraduate school with a major in economics, and then received a master's degree from the Harvard University Graduate School of Business. Initially, Mr. Paul worked for J.P. Morgan, Chase, Salmon Brothers, and Arnold Brothers. Thereafter, he came to Bald Head Island and has guided BHA Limited for over 10 years. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Paul. Next, Mr. Roberts. Lee Roberts is the managing partner of Sharpview Capital, LLC. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from Duke University and a law degree from Georgetown University. He has worked in real estate and finance for more than 25 years. He has worked in government as the budget director for the governor of the state of North Carolina and in private banking and finance at Morgan Stanley, Piedmont Community Bank, and Cherokee Investment Partners. In addition, he has a number of commitments that he has done well for the state in voluntary work. In 2016, along with a partner, Mr. Roberts started Sharpview Capital in Raleigh. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Lee. We appreciate both you and Mr. Paul coming. So let me turn it over now to the two of you, however you choose to split it up with presentations or whatever you prefer, to tell us about your transaction.
Thanks, Alan. So it's interesting. We were in this room 5 years ago talking about this outcome. If I'm not mistaken, Carrie, we had 3 public sessions regarding the authority transaction here. In addition, you hosted a session in Raleigh, and you hosted a session in Greensboro. And we talked about that Mr. Mitchell had passed away and that we needed to have a good transition of the ferry and tram. When we put all that together, boiled down to a couple things. It was not clear whether the village of Bald Head Island could in fact purchase the ferry. State Constitution says local municipalities cannot operate ferries or bridges for toll. We looked at that. We went and we saw the state legislature. Thank you for being here, Mr. Davis. State legislature passed unanimously Senate Bill 391 to create the Bald Head Island Transportation Authority. I would suggest if they thought that the village could buy it, or Southport could buy it, or Brunswick County could buy it, they would have never passed Senate Bill 391. A couple of the contextual issues that surround all of that. The majority of the ferry assets reside in another municipality called Southport. That's where they're domiciled. When we're on the island, I take my direction from the mayor in the village of Bald Head Island. When we're on the mainland, I'm taking my direction from Joe Pat Hatem and Gordon Hargrove. That dynamic was part and parcel of the issues surrounding the ability for the village to purchase that. Don't want to get into it, but I would suggest the annexation situation in North Carolina is very difficult. I'm not sure that Southport was just going to lay down, or the county was going to lay down and let the village acquire assets and operating assets on the mainland. That is a big factor in, I think, why Senate Bill 391 was passed unanimously by the legislature. I would suggest also, too, fact. We had a healthy meeting with Village Council before that bill dropped on the floor of the Senate. The village attorney at the time was involved in drafting Senate Bill 391. I attended several meetings with village attorneys as well as village council members to make sure that there was adequate representation on that board that reflected the island. At the time, there were 6 property owners, residential property owners on Bald Head. There was a majority. Fast forward 4 years later, we're here. We can all speculate, we can all spend hours talking about the facts as to why we're here. We're here because the authority transaction wasn't able to get approved by the LGC. They weren't able to get on the agenda. Not approved, they weren't able to get on the agenda. I would suggest that a great deal of the issue publicly was about value. I would suggest that that's not what the issue was. It was about control. Value was the only way to sabotage the transaction with the authority. So we made a big stink over value. Well, I would suggest that those assumptions were wrong. The assumptions that the Mitchells would not sell it to a third party were wrong. The valuation estimates that people came up with on this island were wrong. I struggle with how 9 financial institutions can underwrite a bond offering by the authority in the $58 million range. I struggle with how Standard & Poor's gave it an investment grade rating. Yeah, it's still a low rating. It's the lowest investment grade rating, but it's the highest investment grade rating on the planet for a non-subsidized ferry system. How is it that those financial experts can come to the conclusion that $47,750,000 at the authority was a bad price? Those are facts. When it was clear that the treasurer was not going to put the authority on the agenda, the Mitchells have to move forward with liquidating the estate. So our marching orders were to go ahead and look for a third-party sale, because the only municipal type transaction the Mitchells will do is with the state legislature. The state legislature dictated how that transaction was going to be. The Mitchells are going to follow that to the letter, if in fact it's going to go that way. The Mitchells fundamentally do not believe that the village of Baldwin Island, that has 278 people that elect those folks who represent less than 10% of the property owners, valuation-wise, and represent less than 10% of the ferry traffic, have the governance capabilities, let alone the operating capabilities, to operate the system for the benefit of everyone. And remember, the ferry and the tram are regulated by the North Carolina Utilities Commission. They are public transportation. It's not Disney World. Public transportation. First come, first serve. Ticket class only by the tickets that you purchase that they regulate and oversee. So basically, last summer, I was instructed a year ago to go start to talk to do a third-party transaction. And actually, that was actually easier because that played to my strengths. So we sized up various opportunities for the Mitchells on what would be the best alternative. We evaluated selling it off in pieces. Just sell the parking system, sell the barge system, sell the ferry and tram system. We had meetings with those folks, talked about doing that. I've known Lee for about 20 years. He and I served in the Banking Commission together. When Senate Bill 391 was passed, I think in the middle of that discussion, Lee was the budget director for the state of North Carolina. So I knew Lee. I went and met with Lee and Governor McCrory because they're part of the legislative process. So he's been involved and understands the politics and understands the system and understands what's going on in Bald Head. He's visited here for many years. He understood. For me, that's a good thing. I want a knowledgeable buyer. I want a buyer that knows what they're buying and what they're getting into. So that was a big plus. Our roles were kind of reversed. So for 7 years, I was one of the lead independent outside directors for Piedmont Bank Holding Companies. Lee was an officer and an operating partner there. So I understand when things don't go well, how he's going to react. Understand when things go well, how it's going to react. I trust his commitments. So as we're evaluating this, we went to New York. I went to New York. I met with a lot of my former business school friends that are in private equity shops or infrastructure shops. Got introduced to a lot of those folks, looked at all that. And I came back and I kind of reported the Mitchells and said, well, sure. The question is, do we want to have someone from New York telling us how to run a ferry down here? And how's that going to fly with all of you all? So, continued to work with Lee. I think about a year ago, August, was when we really got into the due diligence phase, where he started to underwrite everything and look at everything. And one of the other opportunities was that because he's rather local, and many of you know Shirley Mayfield, the CFO of Limited. She's been here 20 years, and I really like to, well, she's probably listening now, she's going to cringe, But she refers to Lee as the hometown boy. That's how she refers to him in the business meetings. But I think we got into earnest on that, and I think that Lee's background in infrastructure and real estate also allowed him the opportunity to evaluate and underwrite other Mitchell assets on the island and off the island, and other Mitchell operations on the island. And the transaction includes a bundle of what we'll call supplemental assets, not just the ferry, tram, barge, and parking assets. So that's how it came to fruition. It was a natural feel. I'll let Lee talk about how he underwrite it. I would suggest that from a third-party transaction opportunity, the ultimate transaction was with Miss Rabin and the authority. This is the penultimate transaction. The system is staying together. All of the employees and all the management are being hired day one. Should be a pretty seamless opportunity. They're together. If it's all the pieces that are together, maybe there's an opportunity to work something out with the folks at that table over there. Maybe not. If they just sell it off to independent parking operations and independent barge operations and independent ferry operators, that opportunity will pass. At least we have it together. All the employees are going to go. We can still run a pretty good seamless operation and transition and still coordinate with the mayor and the village and Chris McCall. So I'm going to pass over to Lee, let him talk about the relationship and talk about where he's at. Thanks.
Thank you all for having me here. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and for discussion. I don't have that much to add to what Chad said as an introduction, but I thought it might make sense just to say a little bit about what has happened and what hasn't happened and what we see our role as being. So Sharpview Capital, which as you heard, I founded 6 years ago and run out of Raleigh, has entered into a definitive agreement with the Mitchell estate to acquire the remaining assets that they own here on the island, with the exception of the residential lots. And so that's the ferry, the tram, the barge, the tug, the marinas on both sides, and then some land and buildings on both sides, including the parking at Deep Point, some undeveloped land around Deep Point, the Chandler building, some parking lots near the marina here on the island. And as Chad says, we've been talking about this for some time, and I think the appeal to the Mitchell family, to the estate, of working with us is that we are, I think, threefold, three attributes. One is that we are local. We're based in Raleigh. We invest in the Southeast only. Most of our investments are in the Carolinas. We've made investments in Wilmington before, and so we're a group that understands not just North Carolina, but as Chad says, I've spent plenty of time here. Our group as a whole understands what Bald Head is, how important it is, how special it is, and that it's not just another transaction, not just another asset. And so I think that was an important factor for the estate, and certainly an important factor for us. The second thing is that we understand the ins and outs of the North Carolina political and regulatory regime, which obviously plays an important part in how these assets are run and operated and how they're regulated. And third, and I think this is important, is that we were able to bring together a ad hoc club of investors to invest in this transaction specifically. So most of the investments that we make out of dedicated funds, limited life funds, where we have a pool of investments. And we didn't think that was appropriate for this investment, because it is a unique cluster of assets. And there's a combination of real estate and infrastructure assets, but which is unusual. But most importantly, the time horizon is different than the kind of investments that we usually make. So our funds they can be up to 12-year funds, and we didn't think that was a long enough period in order to make this investment. We wanted investors who, like us, not only understand and appreciate Bald Head itself, but were able to invest for the long term and hold this diverse bundle of assets for the long term. And so that's what we've done, is we've assembled this club of investors specifically for this transaction, specifically for this this group of assets, and with the ability and the intent to hold for the long term. One of the questions that I've been asked since this deal was announced, and I want to stress that I think most of you know, but judging from the emails I get, not everybody realizes that it hasn't closed yet, and we don't have any control of what's happening right now. But we intend to close on everything besides the regulated assets, the ferry and tram, here relatively soon. We would hope in 60 to 90 days, and that the ferry and tram assets, that needs to wait for Utilities Commission approval, and we think that will be in the fourth quarter. But one of the questions I've gotten is, what do you all know about running a ferry system? You've never owned or run a ferry system before, and that's true. Not too many people have, and if the state had only looked for groups who had operated a ferry system before, the list of potential partners would have been pretty short. But what we do know how to do is own and manage really great management teams who have operational experience. And so I think what you're going to see in terms of change in the day-to-day operations here at Bald Head is virtually nothing. So if you didn't know about this transaction from reading about it, I don't think you would see any change in terms of what it's like to ride the ferry or park at Deep Point or use the marina or anything else. The management team that's been managing these assets, Chad, who's here, Bayon Stewart, who's here, who have been running these assets for a long time and have the operational expertise, they're not going anywhere. They're going to continue to operate these assets on behalf of Sharpview and its investors, as they did on behalf of the Mitchell estate, but with the principle of stewardship for the island and its stakeholders. And it's a diverse group of stakeholders. It's not just the homeowners. If you look at the ridership of the ferry, you've got employees, you've got contractors, you've got homeowners, you've got day trippers, you've got vacation renters. They're all stakeholders in the ecology of the island. And when you think about, as an investment professional, and we've got some people who have spent their careers in the investment world here in the room, there's some investments that are good investments because there's a lot of growth there. There's some other investments that are good investments because they're stable, predictable, long-term investments. And that's how we think about the investments that we're making here at Bald Head. We're not acquiring these assets with the intent of changing anything dramatically or trying to extract some kind of hockey stick type of growth projection. What we're trying to do is acquire on behalf of our investors very predictable, very stable, long-term assets, cash flowing assets that simply perform steadily and well over the long term. Chad talked about the credit rating that the ferry has received. The reason for that is that it is so stable and predictable. And so that's what attracted us and what attracted our investors. And that's what our watchword will be going forward, is trying to maintain that stability and predictability for the operations that we're acquiring here on the island, and that will continue to be run by the same team that's been running them all along. So I look forward to the discussion and to the Q&A, and thank you again for having me here.
Thank you both. I appreciate your comments. And before we get to the question and answer session, I'd like to turn to the next two speakers. The Honorable Peter Quinn the mayor of Bald Head Island. Peter did his undergraduate work at Holy Cross and his master's degree at Washington University. His undergraduate was in economics and his master's was in architecture. About 25 years ago or so, Bald Head Island got very lucky when Peter relocated from the Northeast, upper state New York, with his practice and began to practice architecture here. During those years, Peter has been an architect extraordinaire for us and has designed over 100 of the beautiful homes on Bald Head Island. In addition, Peter has given freely of his time to help the Bald Head Association by serving on the Architectural Review Committee for many years and serving as an architectural consultant for many additional years. In addition, Peter has served and been elected to the BHA Village Council, and most recently has been elected mayor of Bald Head Island. Peter has hit the ground running as our new mayor. Please welcome Peter Quinn. In addition, we have with us today the Honorable Susan Raybon, Chair of the Bald Head Island Transportation Authority. Ms. Raybon graduated from NC State with a major in political science and graduated from the University of Virginia College of Law. She first practiced law with the North Carolina Attorney General, then served as a senior assistant for the governor of North Carolina, then was appointed a commissioner on the North Carolina Utilities Commission. Thereafter, in 2016, Ms. Raybon became a vice president for Commonwealth Home Health Care. In addition to her professional work, she has been a regular leader in the volunteer nonprofit world. In 2017, she was also appointed as chair of the Bald Head Island Transportation Authority and remains in that position. Most recently, she has been appointed a board member of the NC State Board Authority. Ms. Raybon, we welcome you and thank you for coming. With that, let me turn it over first to our good mayor for his comments.
First off, you're going to have to excuse me a little bit. My voice has been coming and going these days. But Alan, Board, thanks for having us. The first myth that I'd like to get rid of for everybody is these people these people up here with me are not our enemies. And when I'm saying our enemies, it's like me. We're working with all these different people. In particular, I am also on the Transportation Authority, as a member of the council. And I've been working with Chad, it seems like forever now, but, but we're all working toward the same end, and we all have the same goal. At times, people like to throw it up as if, it's them and us. It's not them and us. We're all trying to get to the same place. Today, I'd like to talk about transportation on two different levels. The first level is right now our current conditions. And this is not a time that I think it makes sense to poke people in the eye and tell them, what's going wrong. I'm waiting too long. I'm missing ferries. Those things are happening. There's no denying it. And the bigger question is, what is the village going to do about it? I mean, that's the question we get all the time. The reality is that the village is always trying to find the best solution for the stakeholders of this island. When it comes down to the ferry system, we don't own the ferry. Our role right now is we'll take any complaints, any issues that you're confronted with, and we have a wide open type of communication with Chad and with Limited. And so we are going to pass that information along, and we're always in the position that Chad always recognizes that he can call us at any time to support them in forms of communication to let our stakeholders know what's going on. But ultimately, it's a private company. The solution has got to come from them. And so in terms of what is the village going to do to fix this, the village right now cannot fix it. That's not an answer. We can only support Limited fixing anything that comes up. The second level of communication is that the question is, what is the village going to do right now to protect the future? And we're taking a two-pronged approach to this. First, we're in discussions right now. We're talking to Limited and we're talking to Sharpview. We're looking at trying to figure out a way that the village can participate, different service levels, pricing, whatever, to be a player at the table, make stuff happen, and protect the village stakeholders, and the users. I mean, it's amazing to me how much of our transportation system it's just critical to everybody that works here, every company that does business out here, and the stakeholders. And so it's important that we are working with them. And we've had a number of meetings, and I think they're productive meetings. We're not at an end point yet. One of the things it's tough, but to do this type of conversations with Sharpview and Limited, we are bound by NDAs. So how much I can tell you about, what we're talking about, that's not on the table right now. So that is the first thing, that we're talking to them. The second thing is that we're pursuing regulatory relief from the North Carolina Utilities Commission. This includes filing a petition to intervene with the consideration for the application filed by Limited to transfer the ferry system to Sharpview. As an application, as some of you know, the ferry and the tram operation are both currently bound by North Carolina Utilities Commission. So changes in pricing, scheduling, quality control, that is under the purview of the Utilities Commission. But some of you might not know is that the barge and parking is not. When we're looking at this type of thing, you have to be aware that this means that any price increases have to be approved by the NCUC for those other two things. What you may not know is that the parking and barge, at least in our perception, are also monopolies, and they are not regulated. And I'm getting bound up in my notes. I don't like doing this. So if successful, the petition to regulate parking and barge operations will ensure that in the long run, users of the transportation system are assured regulatory oversight of rates and services. All three has intertwined operations as long as they're privately held. I think that what's critical here is when listening to Lee, and I agree with him. I think in the short run, I doubt anybody will notice changes. Things are going to they have really strong management right now. The transitions, I anticipate it's going to be very smooth too. What we're talking about is our children and our grandchildren. When we're looking at having a regulated entity, utility in this case, we would be irresponsible to just assume that the people that are with us right now are going to live forever and always have the same attitude toward our transportation system. We have to, it's something that when we're looking at regulating these things, it is so that we're protecting the stakeholders of this island in perpetuity. The seller's agreement with Sharpview Capital. Okay, so it was announced, and like I said, we've had several meetings, and we hope to find an answer. But ultimately, our responsibility is to you. We will exhaustively review any proposals that come and maintain that they must not be too expensive. require substantial increases in ticket prices or fees, or require property tax increases. As a, almost a final note, I want to say that we're wide open. We've always been wide open with all the entities involved, and we're willing to talk about any role that we might be able to play. I also, just on a sidebar, I just want to thank BHA Club and the association for joining the Utility Commission proceedings. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate your fine comments and your good work for us as our mayor. Ms. Raybon, would you be kind enough to let us have your good thoughts?
Okay, let me make sure I am okay with the microphone person first. So, good morning. Thank you for asking me to be here today. I think you've heard from my introduction by Alan that my life has been spent mainly in public service work. I did practice law for about 5 years in Wilmington years ago before I went on to work for the state. My first visit to Bald Head Island was in 1984, and my guess is that predates a lot of people in this room. I came when I started dating my husband. He already owned a lot over here. So we've spent yes, we were mainly day trippers. We've spent some nights over here, but we have been here numerous times over the years. My first meeting for the Bald Head Island Transportation Authority was December 14th, 2017. Now, who would have thought we'd be sitting here today still talking about this? It's deeply unfortunate, in my view, that the village's 11th hour opposition prevented the authority from purchasing the transportation system from Limited for $47.75 million in early 2021. Honestly, I thought we were all working together until then myself. So, yes, I think that Peter, since he's become mayor and joined the authority, has been working. He and I have had some very good discussions, and we will continue to have those as long as they're open to that. The authority's extensive due diligence and financial modeling had demonstrated that even under low growth conditions, we could have issued the investment grade bonds at reasonable rates and operated a consolidated system with rate increases no larger than inflation. Had that purchase gone forward, the authority and its broadly represented board, which I believe is very, very important, and I realize that it's very important to the property owners at Bald Head and to the village residents, but it's also very important to the other people that come over here every day and live in Brunswick County, the city of Southport, and all over the state, and sometimes from other countries, as well as all over our country. We could have issued those and operated, and I may be repeating myself, I'm sorry, with rate increases no larger than inflation. And we'd already be actively addressing these issues in the system that Peter was saying. I've been getting those emails for years too, since everybody heard about the authority. People have been emailing me as well. And what we do, I have to tell them as well that we don't own the system. So instead, we see the system was sold for $56 million, about $8 million higher than the authority's agreement with Limited, and much, much higher than the low figure that was asserted by others and the village of the system's worth. In addition to the higher sales price, interest rates and presumably expected yields from investments have also risen sharply since early 2021. But Despite those unfortunate events, the authority is nonetheless discussing a variety of scenarios with Sharpview and other entities to determine whether we can responsibly, safely, and affordably operate the system and improve the transportation system with assets purchased or leased from Sharpview. I think the authority was the best solution, and the Mitchells must still think so because they continue to fund us. If there's I think we were asked, Alan, to address what we thought about Sharpview. Would you like me to do that now? I think Sharpview is your next best option. Because if the authority cannot own and operate or lease and operate the system, Sharpview has those resources. They have the network of people. It's important to have a broad network of people involved in this process. When you have your next hurricane over here, you're going to need to call. You're going to need to have a way to go to the governor's office. You're going to need to have a way to go to the legislature. You're going to need to have a way to get emergency management on it as soon as possible. Having people on an authority that are represented, that represent these different categories is a way to do that. And you don't have to just depend on your village government to work on everything else along with trying to get the transportation system back up and running. So I would say Sharpview is your next best option under these circumstances if we cannot find a good solution. And the investors will have the resources in the network. And honestly, you do not want, and I do not mean to say something that will offend anybody, but you don't want a transportation system that is subject to political instability and changes. And that is a very important piece, in my opinion. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Susan. And with that, let's move to the question and answer stage of this event. And the first portion of that is members of the board have the opportunity to ask questions of these speakers. And Robert is going first for us and carrying the water. And Robert Drumheller, would you be kind enough to take the microphone and ask questions?
You want to go first?
Pardon?
I thought you were going to go first.
Oh, no.
All right. Just a little bit of context a bit before we go through the questions. A little over a week ago, I developed 6 questions. You got the wrong setup, Pam. Put the Sharpview questions up first. So just a little over a week ago, I developed 6 questions that I want to ask today for Sharpview and 5 questions I want to ask for the village. In developing these questions, I did not do it on my own. I got some input from our outside counsel. I think, as somebody mentioned, I think Alan, maybe it was Peter. We've intervened in the one of the cases. We have outside counsel. And I also got input from what I'll loosely call some island opinion leaders. So these are not just my questions. So, they reflect the thoughts of several people. I sent the questions in advance a week ago to both parties, so they had an opportunity to think about it. So this is not a stump the stars exercise. I wanted them to, think and, answer them to the best of their ability. And of course, not knowing what anybody was going to say, there is some possibility that some of these have been addressed. So we'll try to make that adjustment as need be. And Pam's going to yell at me if I get the mic too far away, so I'm already been notified of this about 5 times. So why don't we start? And she also asked me, even though we're reading them here in the room, she asked me for the benefit remote audience to actually read the questions individually. So I'm going to do that quickly, hopefully. So is the right, I don't have my glasses on, is the right set up there, the sharp view set? All right, so question number one, given the significant operational problems the ferry faces, particularly during the peak summer months, what changes in operations do you anticipate implementing? Do you believe the implementation of electronic ticketing, reservations, and free bag limitations will go a long way toward mitigating the typical summer disruptions, both in terms of ferry delays and chaotic baggage situations, which are often seen on the island side, particularly during the summer weekends? Do you have any plans for other improvement that will improve customer satisfaction and make the ferry experience more efficient for users? This is a question clearly reflecting what I would call widespread frustration, particularly during the summer time period. And anybody who owns the system, is, whether any of these people owning the system, we need to, in my view, improve the overall customer experience. So I'd just like to get some general observations from Sharpview. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I wouldn't be here if I wasn't looking forward to answering questions. That first question to me is more of a day-to-day operational question. And as I say, our intent, we're investors, we're owners. The day-to-day operational effort is going to be continued by the same team that is in place now, led by Chad and Bayon. So I'm going to let them answer this first question, because to me that's an operational question about the day-to-day running of the system.
So I think the couple of things that will change is we've been working with the authority scenario for the last 4.5, 5 years. The Mitchells are going to allow management to do what it needs to do for the safety of the system and safety of the passengers. I would suggest that if the authority would have happened, or if we would have pursued a third-party transaction, we would have already had another ferry boat laid up in a yard somewhere or purchased it. But with this scenario here, that would be part of going forward in the capital going forward. So that's the first thing. We have been investigating moving towards electronic ticketing for about 2.5 years. COVID interrupted that significantly. The other thing about electronic ticketing is I believe that will require a rate case with the Utilities Commission, because that will impact tariffs and schedule. Bayon and I have narrowed down our network now to 3, but really 2 ticket providers that we've met with. They will be coming to the island and be coming to the mainland in season. We want them to see what's going on in season. And I think once we move towards electronic ticketing, then you can move towards electronic reservations. And that's why we'll have to have something with the Utilities Commission in that discussion, because now we have passenger reservations. So we've got to deal with things like an island entity buying the entire 730 boat for the entire season. What does that do to everybody else? We need to go through those mechanics. I think if we move to electronic ticketing, the baggage situation will be able to actually tie a bag to an individual. We won't have what we have now, where we have third-party providers picking up people, taking them to the ferry, and leaving their bags outside without a tram reservation and expecting our folks to pick that stuff up. In terms of on-time performance, I think an electronic system will help that as well. I would suggest an on-time performance in delayed ferries and bump boats are better this year than they were before COVID in the 2019 year. We've had less bump people and less delayed ferries than in 2019 before COVID, year to date. We'll see how the balance of the year goes out. So I would suggest that all of the capital ideas that we've come up with that we know we want to make, that's our budget. That's what Lee is committed to following through on and his team with those ideas. I would suggest one thing is probably end up having to buy a used ferry and recondition it because of the way the shipyards are right now, trying to get new vessels built. It's 2 or 3 years just because of the parts shortage. So some of you don't know, but we have completely repowered the Patriot. That's what we've been doing for the last 4 to 6 months. And honest to goodness, it's a $29 part made in Southeast Asia that we can't get that holds us up. But we're dealing with the Coast Guard, we're dealing with the folks, we got to lay it up, we got to do it. But the good news is that will be a Q-class vessel. We will move from a K-class to a Q-class vessel. That's going to be what we're going to do with all the boats. We're going to move those. Some we won't, some we'll sell off and we'll replenish with new vessels. But that's how we expect to tackle it. I would also suggest too, remember, it's public transportation on the ferry and the tram. You cannot build a system for 4th of July. It'll be too expensive. You build a system to operate on the 4th of July, what happens in January, February? You can't slack it down. You can't scale it down like that. But that's a problem we've been facing on this island clearly since I've been here, but probably for the last 35 years, right? So there's some balance there. Are we behind? We are behind. We are behind. Why are we behind? Because of the dynamics of the Mitchell estate and transferring the system. But I can assure you, we know what we want, just like we brought the new tug on. Put the new tugboat on, that was needed. The old tugboat had 4 million equivalent truck miles on it. I would suggest that in the future, we'll probably not sell any of the 4 ferries. We'll go to a 5-ferry fleet. That's what Brian and I've talked about, go to a 5-ferry fleet. I think the next boat is a catamaran. I think at some point in time, we sell one of the monohulls and bring on another catamaran, but always have a monohull. If you've been on the island and you've lived on the island, you've been here for storms, you need that monohull. For those monohulls don't basically act like a sail out on the water. The last boat, when we have weather situations that leaves the island, is always a monohull. So I would suggest that we will have at least one monohull vessel in the fleet for all kinds of reasons. So we're aware of it. We talked to the Utilities Commission about it. But again, public transportation where it's at is difficult. I would also suggest too, 8,000 plus round trip ferry trips every year. 375,000 passengers. Do we have complaints? Do we have issues? Yes, we do. Especially at the height of the season. We're not going to deny that. But I would also suggest too, when you benchmark that against any other ferry system in the country, there's no one that's running 8,000 30-minute boats. There's no one that's running 8,000 round trips a year. One of the things I would also suggest that's gonna happen is when we move from Indigo in 2009 to Deep Point, that added about 5 to 7 minutes to the ferry trip in distance. Doesn't sound like a lot. When you're doing 30-minute boats, 5 to 7 minutes when you have storms or delays is huge. There's been talk for years about going to a 45-minute schedule. Emotions kept us from doing a 45-minute schedule because people are like, wait, I know what my boat is in 40. If we go to electronic ticketing, it becomes much easier to go to a 45-minute schedule. And I would suggest that is something that makes sense, is to move to a 45-minute schedule. So those are the things that we're working on, both from a capital standpoint, that we're working on with the Utilities Commission and with Lee. And he's committed to follow through with that capital plan and that operational plan. And our folks are working internally. We should have both of those ticketing vendors, and we want a vendor that can do the ticketing for the tram and do the ticketing for the ferry. We're not going to split it. We need a solution. We're not going to do what Limited did in the past, which is hire our own programmers and develop our own software. That's not the best interest for the island or for the system. We're going to get real professional third-party ticket providers to help put that in place. So that's, I think, the answer to number one.
All right, thanks, Chad. This is a question that's hopefully more directed towards Lee, more conceptual, philosophical. Would you commit to Pelican Logistics LLC as owner of the parking system, continuing, oh, Pam's yelling at me, continuing the existing annual $525,000 cross subsidy from parking revenues to the ferry transportation system to keep the future ticket prices lower than they otherwise would be? As I don't know if everybody knows, perhaps most people know that I think it was 2010, Limited agreed to provide an annual $525,000 cross subsidy. Obviously, we would like to see that moving forward.
Yeah, so that question reflects a detailed knowledge of North Carolina utility law. And as Scott and Susan and others here know, the way the Utilities Commission calculates what they call the rate base for the pricing of the ferry tickets does include that subsidy, and so I don't see that changing. But there's a bigger question in there just about fares generally, not just for the ferry, but for the barge and for the parking, and maybe this gets to the next question as well. So I think they're really all, I think of them all in a similar way. Even though the ferry is regulated and the barge and the parking are not, which is that, and not to get into a philosophical discussion about regulation versus the free market, but I believe that if incentives are aligned, no amount of regulation is going to, if incentives are not aligned, no amount of regulation is going to overcome that. And if incentives are aligned, you don't really need regulation. And I believe that our incentives are very much aligned with the users and the stakeholders, not just the homeowners, but as I said earlier, all of the stakeholders here on Bald Head. And I think that's been true from the beginning. I think you see that with how the pricing has behaved for the barge and the parking, where the current owners really, at least on paper, there's no regulatory reason for them to keep pricing under control. But their incentive is to keep pricing under control. And the incentives for us and for our investors are the same, regulation or no regulation. So what we want, as I said earlier, is very stable, very predictable cash flows from these investments. And if we were to raise prices dramatically, or try to milk the system in some way, then we would lose usage. We would lose ridership of the ferry. We would lose usage of the barge and the parking. People talk about a monopoly, but I don't really think they behave like a monopoly economically. So not only are there substitutes, right? Everyone knows about CTO. I've got a friend whose son runs people on and off the island for $20. You know, you can find other ways to get to the ferry terminal. I was on the ferry this morning. Most of those people weren't homeowners, right? They were day trippers and employees, and they'll find a different way to get to the ferry if they need to, if it's too expensive. But also, more importantly than substitutes, is usage will just go down if the prices aren't kept under control. How many of you take the ferry into Wilmington or Southport for the day, even though you don't strictly need to? Well, if the prices rise too quickly, the marginal user of the ferry won't do that. Claude Pope will hire one less employee. And so if usage goes down, then we've lost the stability and predictability that is the thesis behind our investment. So I really think, regulated or unregulated, that we're incentivized to keep prices under control. I do think for the pricing of the ferry in particular, it's been regulated for 20 years. Fares have gone up once in that time. So we've committed to the Utilities Commission that we won't ask for an increase in fares for a year after we acquire the system. And as I say, I think that will close in the fourth quarter. So it's not even on the table until a year from the fourth quarter, a year and a half from now. After that, I do think that you'll see a price increase, but I think it will be very much in line with the cost of living. I think it's unrealistic to expect that that one element would stay stable while the cost of everything else goes up. But as you've seen with the parking and the barge over time, I think that you'll see very slow, very steady cost increases in line with cost of living increases, just as you see with parking at the airport, for example, where you never show up at the airport and parking has tripled, but sometimes you show up at the airport and parking's $1 more than it was a year before. And I think that's what you can expect to see in terms of the fares for all three of these operating businesses: the barge, the parking, and the ferry.
All right, thanks, Lee. I'm going to skip over 3 because I think you largely addressed that in your comments. So let me move on to 4. If it turns out that the barge and the parking do actually become regulated, is that likely to result in any meaningful increase or decrease in future rates that otherwise would be charged in an unregulated environment? Could there be a large plant acquisition adjustment which might end up increasing the rates over what they otherwise would be? What I'm trying to get at is if it does turn out to be regulated, could we be potentially worse off, perhaps at the beginning, because of some mechanics of how the regulation sets the pricing?
Yeah, it's back to Utilities Commission math, and it's a good point. I do think that that's a risk because of the way the Utilities Commission calculates what they call the rate base. They've got a reasonably complex formula. Scott's lived this as has Susan, for how they calculate the cost of providing a service. And I think you're right. I think there's a decent chance that if you incorporate the other operating businesses that are currently not regulated, the way they calculate a rate base could end up with a rate increase. It reinforces what I said earlier, which is that we don't really think there's a need for regulating the parking and the barge because we think incentives are already aligned. That we would be short-sighted and foolhardy to raise rates for either of those operating businesses beyond normal cost of living increases, which is what the commission would allow under any circumstances. And so I think we believe that the status quo from a regulatory standpoint is the best answer for that reason, among others.
Okay, this is a pretty quick yes or no on the next one. Are all 4 subsidiaries on the org chart that you filed with the NCUC 100% owned by Pelican Legacy Holdings? This gets to really is a lead into number 6. Do we have a continuity of ownership across all the various operations, which would suggest we have continuity of the interest in the integrated operation? Whereas if you have different ownership interest in the subs, you're not going to have that kind of synergistic look at the system.
Yeah, to me, third parties can mean 2 different things. So if by third parties you mean groups who are not in this room, that's one thing. If by third parties you mean anybody other than SharpView.
I'm talking about the investors. Are the ultimate investors across the 4 subs all the same? In your filings, at some point, you mentioned that one of them was, quote, a 100% owned operation. In other contexts, you talk about them as being affiliates, and typically in a business environment, affiliates suggest that the ownership interest is less than 100%.
No, our ownership group is 100% the same across all of the businesses.
So to answer directly, what will happen is exactly the same setup that the Mitchells have right now. The ferry and tram that's regulated is in its own separate entity. That entity is 100% owned by Limited. That's the structure. Okay. The exact same ownership structure we have today is the exact same ownership when SharpView buys it. Okay, so all the pieces have to be by themselves.
All the people who are actually putting money in terms of equity, they all participate across all the sectors: the barge, the parking, the ferry operation. Okay, same group. Okay, all right, thanks. Then the last question. Would you seriously consider over the next few years a resale or lease of individual system components to a third party or parties that would be different in ownership or economic interests among the three business lines? I mean, I think clearly from our perspective as users here, our interest, I think, would be to make sure that all segments of the system are owned by a single entity as opposed to having different people with different interests.
Right, so that's what I was saying about third parties. We would love to find ways to cooperate with the authority and with the village, and as the mayor said, we've been having those discussions. And so if you include them as third parties, then that's the status. We would be eager to cooperate with the mayor and the authority as stakeholders. If you're talking about totally unrelated third parties, not in this room, that's not our plan. As I say, we've put together an ownership group that is specifically constructed to hold and operate these assets for the long term. I don't want to be coy about that. I have to say that that's not our plan because I'm a fiduciary for the investors who we've assembled. If somebody were to show up tomorrow and say, hey, we'll pay you 3 times what you paid for one of those assets, that's something I'd have a responsibility to my investors to consider and take seriously. But that's not our plan. That's not how we've underwritten this deal. That's not something I see happening. Our plan is to own these assets for the long term, and that's how we've underwritten the deal, and that's what we've said to our investor group.
Okay, thanks. Pam, could you put the village questions up? Peter, I'm going to skip over the first question because I think you kind of addressed that in your initial comments, so thank you for that. The second question really is to confirm what I think you've already said publicly, but just to confirm for the benefit of everybody. If the village still seeks to own the transportation system, how would it be affordable given the $56 million market value placed on the assets in an arm's length private sale? But what I'm really getting at is, you're still pursuing the possibility of actually trying to buy the system, or have you really abandoned that aspect of your strategy?
Okay, Robert, we're not going to do that. What I want to go back to the first question, because I think there's issues with that first question that I'd like to address.
Okay, well then I'll read it for the benefit of the remote audience. It has sometimes been difficult to understand the village's overall strategy. You seem to be pursuing or suggesting several avenues of litigation simultaneously, including the NCUC petitions to regulate the parking and the barge, potential litigation to enforce the so-called 99 first right of refusal, and the possible use of eminent domain to seize private assets. Could you summarize the village's goals and strategies and how these different litigation, NCUC, and other efforts are advancing your goal?
Okay, so first off, excuse me. First off, I want you to know that the village takes very seriously its duty to protect the public and ensure oversight. You know, when I read the question that you sent, there's a couple of things that don't sound right to me. First off, the so-called right of refusal. The right of refusal is not so-called. It exists. There's discussions that Chad and I have had whether it'll hold up in court, but it does. I'm sorry. Yes. So it's not a so-called right of refusal. It exists. Chad and I have had discussions about whether it would actually hold up to litigation. Village lawyer says yes, Chad says no, but it's real, okay? Notions about eminent domain, yeah, that's like a last resort, you know, everything's going wrong, we're gonna have to take over somehow. The question itself brings up some extremes that I think are off. And it's from my perspective, and I think it's this island in a lot of ways, we go through this situation where these extremes become loud and distorted and doesn't further the action. And so, you know, I'd really like to ask the village in general, all the stakeholders, to kind of try and tone that down. Let's have discussions as opposed to extreme statements. So the question of where is the village going, you know, it seems confusing. It's not confusing. It's very straightforward. The village is interested in getting the safest, most reliable situation on the board as we can. We're not looking at this as a short-term element. This is something that's going to be affecting the village long after we're gone. And actually, you know, if you believe, and I do, Lee's statements and Chad's statements that, you know, you're not going to notice the difference. We're not going to notice the difference. But in 20 years, and 30 years, I don't know what's going to happen. And when we talk about, yeah, somebody comes and they'll give me 3 times the amount, you know, I have to answer to my investors. We have to answer to our children. And so when we're looking at whether we should be regulating something or not, we have to be looking at this in perpetuity. So the Mitchells were divesting. Everybody knows this. You know, everything's on the block. And the question is, can we count, it's the same question again, can we count on the next person to I think Lee described it as the incentives aligned. God, I hope so, but I don't know. You know, it's a strange economy right now, and, you know, 30 years, inflation, they're going to just like, $56 million, it's only worth $25 now, you know. Who knows? It's just a different situation. Going to the question of what our role is as a village. The village is responsible for looking out to our constituents. So whenever the village stepped in, and you know, when Susan was talking about the TA, and you know, the village stepped in here, and at least to my ears, it sounded like the village ruined it. The village stepped in because the village financially was more, it was a better deal. We had better rates on our funds. We had better rates on our funds. We had in our proposal that we put together before the LGC initial investments that we're going to be making right away. I think it was to the tune of 4 or 5 million, 4 million on day one. We had in our pro forma, we had worked out that, you know, there was $1.5 million that we were going to be able to reinvest every year. We had a tighter connection through the village government for accountability. Like everybody at this, well, except for Chad, everybody else, we're going to be looking at other management. You know, Chris McCall is not going to be running the Ferry. It never was going to. So just had to get rid of some of these myths that are hanging out there. So when we stepped in with the Transportation Authority, it was because we had better rates, we had more accountability, we were answering the needs of the village. When things started going south, we didn't stop. We started working with the Transportation Authority. So there was a period, and we got really close. We were. You don't agree with that? Well, okay. So we had a series of meetings with members of the board, the Transportation Authority, for working together as collaborators. We were never invited to the table to put our proposal out, and you know, for whatever reason that is with the Mitchells, but the village at least saw us like maybe if we're working with the Transportation Authority, then that would be something that would be honored. Since then, now we're working with Sharpview. We're talking to Sharpview, trying to find out how we can protect our stakeholders. You know, the parking and barge operations, NCUC, yeah, that's what I said already, that those are critical things to be looking at in the long run. Okay, now you can go to question 2.
All right, just to summarize question 2, do you still have an interest in potentially buying the system? And if so, is that a possibility given the potentially higher price that's associated with the Sharpview, you know, thinking of what the values are here?
Yeah, there's 2 different stories there. One is, are we interested in buying? we're not interested in buying at the price tag right now. It's not something that, I say that, but it's, that's more of my perception. It wouldn't, I don't know that it would be responsible to the island to be taking on a, debt like that. Question whether we can afford it. I firmly believe that we have rates that we can get, and we have resources we can go after, reserve funds, and so I think we could afford it. The question is whether it makes sense. And in all these things, in everything that we've done, it goes back to question one, is everything we've done, it's like, what are we doing? Does it make sense are we putting the village in a better position in the next 10 years, 20 years?
Okay, number 3, at times during 2021, the village, certain island residents who wrote to the LGC, the state auditor, a number of others, all expressed the view that a $48 million purchase price for the ferry system was significantly too high. I think Susan mentioned this in her earlier comments this morning. What comments do you have, assuming the Sharpview deal closes, about the proposed $56 million purchase price and the financial impact to the system users for a transportation system that could have been sold to the BHA last year for $48 million and financed in a lower interest rate environment?
Yeah, there's two questions there, and I think it's important to realize that the village was also willing to purchase the transportation system at that number that the VA was looking at. And actually, what I was describing earlier, I think it would have been a better deal. And I know Susan disagrees with me. Okay. In terms of what, going back through my notes, so Sharpview, I can't explain how they worked up their numbers, and I haven't seen their numbers. The background that, we've been given here at the meeting and my introduction of they're making their decisions. They're not dumb guys, so, what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it, I can't answer that question.
All right, the next question. Some stakeholders have commented that your NCUC and litigation efforts are potentially poisoning relationships with Limited, the Mitchells, Southport, Brunswick County, and possibly certain members of the NC General Assembly, all of whom have a different vision for the system than the vision of the village. How do you respond to this?
Yeah, these are hard times. Those are really tough decisions to go to the Utilities Commission. It's an investment for all of us legally, but at the same time, it's what I was saying before, it's a long-term investment. And sometimes you're doing the right thing and it might piss people off. And if, while you can say some stakeholders and some people on the General Assembly and some here, some there, it's like you can't do anything. As an example, you can't do anything on this island without having people that don't agree with you and people that do agree. So it's we're not going to be making our decisions based on somebody's feelings. It's going to be based on what's best for the stakeholders here.
Okay, the last question. What would you estimate the total amount of cash expenditures that will have been made by the village and paid for by island property owner taxes for legal, financial, and other related costs to pursue your strategy to its final conclusion? Would a range estimate of, say, $650,000 to $1 million be reasonable?
Yes, I think it would be reasonable. We're firm in our conviction toward this being a wise investment in terms of finding the best solution. This is a critical lifeline to the island. And when you're looking at those kinds of dollars for something that every single thing that happens on this island is controlled by those, yes, it's an investment. It's interesting. A friend of mine pointed out to me, he's like, in the short term investment, it's when you're looking at it, cost is the short term and what you pay. Value is long term and what you get. And so when you're looking at this, it's like, that's a big ticket. It's like, yeah, it's a big ticket, one time. And what we're looking at is an investment that the impact of the investment is forever.
Okay, Alan, fine. Thanks. Thank you, Peter.
All right. Do other board members have questions? Yeah. Tiffany, did you say yes? Okay, would you pass this down to Tiffany, Robert?
I think they have their own.
I'm good.
Ours is better.
Susan mentioned that the Mitchells are still funding the Transportation Authority. What role is the Transportation Authority performing right now and/or in the future as the sale progresses?
We are right now in the waiting mode to see how this turns out, what happens. The authority is more than willing to, if Sharpview and we can come to an agreement, to still be involved in operating the system, if they would be willing to lease, or I don't know that purchasing without some help from somewhere else would be a good decision for the authority right now. But we are willing to still work to find a way to run the system and hope that we can provide that transportation system for everybody that uses the system.
Robert has covered 4 out of my 5 questions, so I just have one left. I've had some questions about the future of the Deep Point Marina. There is a different strategy in the Bald Head Island Marina versus the Deep Point Marina. In Bald Head Island, the slips are owned by individuals. In Deep Point, they are leased on a monthly basis. What is Sharpview's plan moving forward?
I think that marina is a good business for that reason. So that's an important part of what attracted us to the investment overall. Is it's an attractive operating business. It's hard to build new marinas on the North Carolina coast, and so we think the value will only continue to increase. We plan to operate it as a marina.
Okay, and would there be any thought on the Deep Point Marina to selling the slips to individuals, or have you thought that through yet?
We haven't gotten that far, but that's definitely a possibility.
Did that complete your question, John?
John, a couple of things regarding that. What's operational about the marina here on Bald Head is very similar to the operation at Deep Point, which would allow to condominiumize that and create a Deep Point Yacht Club. And the reason what operation allows for it is we have 2 dedicated spoil islands on the mainland, where we have a dedicated spoil island here. And if you recall, we formed the Marina Association with the village, transportation, and the yacht club, and transferred that spoil island into the Marina Association. So that dredging and things like that, that's the biggest issue around condominiumizing, is you can't really condominiumize if you don't know what you're going to do with a spoil in 30 years, right? So technically, we could basically create the exact same ownership structure, exact same pass-through structure here on the island as a template at the mainland.
Does any other board member have questions? Before we get to the members, I do have one additional question for Peter, if I may. Is my mic on? Yes, okay. Peter, and I don't want to talk about the past. I sort of want to talk about now, the present. What do we do? And that is, there is a proposal now, an application before the North Carolina Utilities Commission to transfer ownership from limited to Sharpview. And we're trying now to collect information for our members to guide them as to whether they should support this and be happy about it, or whether they should oppose it. From what I've heard from Chad, from Lee, from Susan, is we should support it. I'm interested in your view. What should our members do? Should they oppose this transaction, or should they support it?
Yeah, so Alan, I have an answer and I don't have an answer. So there's you have the village position versus Peter Quinn's position. Okay, so I personally, we've been talking back and forth, and there is, whether Sharpview's the right people or not, my gut feeling is that this might be the way that things should go. That's me personally. As a village, we're looking at it very seriously, and you're looking at. We just need to understand Sharpview well to say, yeah, these are the guys that we want to step in. We haven't gotten to that level of due diligence that I know of, but we are doing it, and we will do it because we're not going to hold this up. It's account.
And do you find Lee is cooperating? Lee is cooperating with you to get you the information you need so you can decide whether or not they're good for us?
Well, I think we've been, Lee isn't so we've been getting a lot of information via Chad. Lee and Chad are working as a team on this, and so we have been getting information as we're asking for it, and I anticipate we're going to be asking for more information. I'm going to defer to Scott. You want to talk for a minute? Scott's been our main person connected with the NCUC application.
And when you say Scott, you mean Scott Gardner, the
Gardner,
Mayor Pro Tem.
That's right.
Thank you, Alan, and I'll try to be very brief. So there's a lot of information exchange that needs to happen to understand whether the village should get behind the transfer application. I certainly see a scenario where we can. We anxiously await to go through the process with the Utilities Commission. We expect they will be the ones asking serious questions about capital investment. They'll be the ones asking serious questions about service levels going forward, the types of things the Utilities Commission does and always does. And as we follow through that and the answers come out beyond what was discussed today, at some point, we'll be able to make a decision whether to support or not.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Peter. I don't have any further questions, and I will now turn to the portion of the program today in which the members can ask questions. And let me just go back and identify the procedure that will follow here, and that is members will have the opportunity to ask their questions. We ask that you hold your questions, comment until that time. For those who are attending in person, we'll invite you to the podium where we have a microphone set up so those who are connecting remotely can hear you. For those who have questions but cannot attend in person, email your questions to be asked at the meeting to Carrie by 11, and we'll work to get all of those questions answered today, and I'll read those. And her email address is carrie@baldheadassociation.com. And note that duplicate questions may be grouped by topic, and questions will be asked as time allowed. So let me ask first, are there any people here present who would like to ask a question? Yes, please come forward, if you would, up to the podium. And when you get up there, I'd like you to state your name and your age. Oh, no.
Joel Michaels, 307 Whalehead Way. Been coming to the island since 1991, an owner of property here since 2002. And, you know, don't get me started as to how we got to this place, okay? And I don't want to create more dissension. I just view where we are as unfortunate. And I'll probably also make one comment about Mr. Roberts, who I know is well-intentioned and appreciate his local connections. But in terms of the economic interests being aligned, I hope they will be, but it is in essence a monopoly that you'll have with this, with the system assets that you'll own and control. So the village, the residents, the question is what kind of leverage, if any, will we have if things go south, either with you or with a successor? So that's a concern. And then maybe a more substantive question is for Susan. I thought you mentioned maybe a step, because I'm assuming this transaction is going to go through. I'm also assuming that whatever legal challenges occur with the Utilities Commission will not come out favorably to the village or other participants who are asking that the Utilities Commission incorporate the barge and these other pieces to it. So, but you said something to the effect of, well, the Sharpview will acquire it, and then we, the Transportation Authority, could lease those assets. Did I get that wrong or misinterpreted? Yeah.
Thank you. That is an option. But we're not there yet because we don't know if it would be affordable.
Okay. I'm not sure I understand the economics, the steps of that, as to whether that adds more complexity to the transaction, more costs and so forth. I get it. It would give a input for this body involving Southport, Brunswick County, and the village input into the process. But I wasn't quite sure. Is that a real step that's likely to occur in the near future?
The statute allows us to lease the system.
Okay.
So that would be one that we would certainly look into.
Okay. That's my question.
We still have a mission.
Thank you, Joel. Are there any other members present? Or Chad, would you like to comment in
I
response?
just want to comment. So a couple of things about monopoly businesses. So I've been here now 11 years. We've transferred and sold to third parties more than 21 monopoly businesses on the island. None of them are regulated. Thank goodness I'm not getting the calls anymore for how much a gallon of milk costs. Okay? And Claude will know that the day we closed on that transaction about 11 years ago, that was the thing that I was most excited not to have, was the phone calls about the cost of milk. My point being is, we've transferred 21 monopoly businesses to include the clubs. No failures, not a single failure. No post-closing or pre-closing lawsuits, not a single one. The island's still here. It didn't blow away. The club's doing just fine. The merger with the Shoals Club has done just fine. Claude Pope's doing well. Old Ebb and Flows is doing well as Mojo's. Delphina is doing well, replacing the River Pilot. The spa, the art gallery. Those were all monopolies. Remember, 11 years ago, every single commercial operation on the island, every single piece of commercial property was owned by the Mitchells. And we've transferred that and given updates over time. Those were all monopolies.
Chad, the difference that I see is the Mitchells had an economic interest in the value of the land, okay, the land investments, and that's not part of this transaction. The Sharpview engagement is detached from the value of the land. So I understand the point. By enhancing those monopolies, you also enhance the values, the market, added value to all of us as property owners. And yes, a good ferry system will do the same, but Sharpview doesn't have an economic tie to the land that the Mitchell family did and the legacy that they left behind.
That is a very fair point. And that is something that we discussed in this very room 5 years ago. Go back and look at the tapes. I know Dick was here. I know Kerry was here. I suggested don't let the ferry be the last thing the Mitchells have a big stake in. Don't let that happen. Get it done beforehand so they have to eat their cake. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way. Very, very fair point.
Thank you, Chad and Joel. Anyone else present, please come up, please forward. And please state your name and address.
I'm Sally Shooping Russell. I have a house here at 4 Ballantrae Court. My permanent residence is in Chapel Hill. I have the distinct honor of knowing people on both sides of this very well. I've known Lee for longer than I've known any of the rest of you all. And I've known the rest of you all for for about anywhere between 10 and 20 years. So with that said, I guess I'm trying to say I'm really kind of excited that Sharpview is involved in this. My investment is in investing and my background. And so I had two, you all may consider technical questions, but they're really sort of important. And they are two are for Lee and one's for Chad. Lee, why do you have a 3-structured tier of LLCs here? Number one, and are the same people, the same members, not the member managers, but the members of each of those LLCs the same?
Yeah, the LLCs are just for regulatory reasons, so that you've got the regulated business and the non-regulated business, but it's all the same ownership. There's a top co that has all the investors go into that, and then the particular operating entities sit underneath that. But it's identical ownership across the investment from our perspective.
But the member manager, you all are the member manager, right? And the members in each of those groups are the same?
Yeah, they are.
Okay. And that's an area where things can kind of get snuck in, which is the reason I'm asking that question. The second is, we've all been talking about 3 areas, the barge, the ferry, and the real estate, but you've got a 4th box here, which is intellectual property. Can you give us a little bit more information on what that involves?
So the intellectual property is predominantly just the names and the URLs, the websites. So you go to baldheadislandferry.com to book your tickets. That URL, that website address conveys with the transaction for obvious reasons.
So what other types of IP are there?
That's the big one.
I mean, that it's big enough that it have a separate unit on it.
The big ones are the websites and the URLs, the copyrights,
Okay.
the logo. We will get a license for the logo for 20 years. That will transfer. The Mitchells will transfer a license for the logo for 20 years to Sharpview. But those are the big ones. It's mostly web URL electronic is the copyrighted material, and that's what we're talking about from the IP.
The idea is just that it continues to look seamless when you go online and book a ferry ticket.
Okay. The reason I'm asking, because those are obviously the pieces that could all be chopped off if you wanted to, and I was curious about the value there. And Chad, this is my question for you, which is at the beginning of your comment here, you talking about the running of things after this transaction takes place. I believe you said, quote, back up. You seem to be saying that had all this not happened, there were things like getting a new boat, et cetera, that would have happened and then you said, I think this quote, the Mitchell family had said they will allow, that after this, now, the Mitchell family said that they will allow management to do what it had planned to earlier, which made me wonder, is the Mitchell family still going to be involved in operating these assets?
No, the Mitchell family will not be involved in operating the assets. Your question's a good one. So, for example, I can distinctly recall when I first got here having a meeting at the club with Robert Norton and others about, look, we can't wait years to have a rate case again. We've had one rate case in 30 years. Can't do that. Problem is, we've gone 12 years without one. The reason why we didn't do one is we can't do a rate case in the middle of the legislation with the North Carolina General Assembly and have a rate case on top of trying to do an authority. So that's why we're delayed in that rate case, and that gets back to the whole rate case proposition with the rate base and the Mitchells. It just made sense to defer that to work through whatever process we were going to work through. And the estate has a fiduciary duty. They have to liquidate the estate, and to try to transact with Sharpview and have a rate case at the same time also doesn't make sense.
Okay, thanks. That covers my questions. Gary, you can trash mine from, I was unclear that we needed to, we're going to have first, so I'll send them to you also.
Thank you very much. Who's next? Please step up and state your name and your address on the island.
Sure. My name's Jeff Kenny. We've had a house at 3 Grove Court for 23 years. And my question's for Sharpview. Totally different approach, looking towards the future. Would you consider having a kind of an, I'll say, an independent sounding board or advisory committee or something that takes it upon various stakeholders, for instance, full-time residents, other homeowners who rent, other homeowners who do not rent, maybe some of the rental agencies, the commercial entities, the village, the BHA, perhaps Southport as well, but just as, you know, fresh set of eyes, non-confrontational, but a discussion group that may be more effective than either ad hoc surveys.
Yeah, I think that has a lot of merit. So we've, as you've heard, we've been in good discussions with the village, with the Transportation Authority. Obviously, we're here talking to the association, but the users of the ferry in particular are pretty. There's several different categories of users there, as I say, including day trippers and staff and contractors. And so having a way for all of those stakeholders to have input into the operations, I think would be a good idea.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the people who are here? Richard? Doctor, please come forward.
Richard Beavers. I'm at 107 Turk's Head Court. I've got 2 questions for Mr. Paul. First, how are the rate payers better off by these assets remaining free from regulatory oversight? And also, number 2, if the parking and barge operations remain unregulated, what's to prevent the new owners, whoever it may be, from doubling, tripling, or even more these rates? And also, what's to prevent the new owners from selling the, say, the parking area to a dedicated provider or operator?
It's all good questions. So I would just suggest that the Utilities Commission math, when they develop a rate base, they look at the value of the underlying assets, what assets can be depreciated over time, and they build a rate base. Well, I would suggest that the parking and barge assets at $56 million is going to result in a higher rate base, potentially, probably, than where the Mitchells and any future buyer like Lee is going to put it. So I would suggest that if you want to value barge, all of the assets in barge and that operation as a regulated entity out of the gate, you're not going to use the Mitchell's basis from 40 years ago. It's going to be new basis. Same thing with parking, new basis. The ferry and the tram, they run off of old basis. So that's why I think you would see an increase in rates, notwithstanding our current required rate of return on the ferry is 8.33%, which we've never met. We've never received that rate. Today, that rate would be lower, Scott, right? I mean, it would be much lower than 8.33, probably in the 6 range. But even still, with that factored in, because the rate base would be higher, I think you'd see a bump in tickets. So the barge tickets have been raised twice since 2006, way below inflation. The tugboat was $2 million. If you do utilities math and divide that by 10 years on an amortization schedule, which is kind of what they do, 10 to 15 years, that's $200,000 a year right there in added rate base to compare to the ticket. So, and then the same thing would go for parking, would be the same thing with parking. That will have a rate base that will be based on today's basis, not what the Mitchells paid for it, 40 years ago. So that's the balance. I think the key is how do you maintain rates stable, lower over the long term? And that's really what the authority did, provided the opportunity for lower rates stable over the long term. There's nothing to say that the investors, the lead investors, don't go down in a fiery plane crash and things get sold off tomorrow to somebody else. I think the difference, though, is right now, when you look at the complaints to have it regulated, it boils down to, wait a second, we want you to regulate parking and barge because we're afraid of what someone may or may not do in the future. And I would just suggest, I think Lee pointed out, that it's not going to be some exercise in MBA math where you're going to push the Pareto frontier on rates where you're balancing between losing users and unit sales to drive rates. That doesn't work. That's not the reality of what we have. So I would suggest that I'm confident that Lee has underwritten the project based on standard rates of return for capital investment and basis rates of inflation. That's the basis of the investment because that's how it's going to have to be run. Either way, whether it's regulated or not, it has to be run that way. But good questions. Good questions.
Do you mind if I just add something? So, first of all, hopefully we can avoid the fiery airplane crash scenario. But I just go back to what I said about incentives. I really think regulation or no regulation that doubling or tripling the price of anything would just be completely counterproductive. And I think the market's actually a really good example. The market's not regulated. The Claude isn't selling lots on the island. He charges a little bit more than the Food Lion and Raleigh charges. I think everyone understands why that is. It costs a little more to provide a gallon of milk here than it does there. But he's not going to double or triple his charge for a gallon of milk overnight for the same reason that we're not going to do that with parking or the barge or the ferry. Again, regulated or unregulated, it would destroy the business. Or whether it's a monopoly or not, as I say, I don't really agree with the characterization, but you always have the ability to not use it or to use it less. And I think thinking as a homeowner, saying this is the only way to get on and off the island, even if that were true, the marginal user of the ferry is not the homeowner. It's a cost-sensitive employee or day tripper, and the entire business, the entire investment, from our perspective, depends on the continuation of this very steady usage. It grows very slowly. It's very predictable, and the fastest way we could mess it up as investors for the people who have entrusted us with capital would be to do anything that would impair the usage, that would hurt ridership of the ferry, hurt usage of the barge, hurt usage of the parking. So that's what I mean when I say the incentives are aligned. I think that's more powerful than any regulation.
Thank you. Kevin, please state your name, your full name, and your address on the island.
Sure. Thanks, Alan. Kevin Arado, 112 Steed Bonnet. We've been property owner here since 2012, and we're now permanent residents here. I think the first one is for Chad. Just to clarify this, the Utilities Commission has to approve this, right, for the private sale?
Yes, the Utilities Commission has to approve the transfer of the certificate from limited to short view as it relates to the ferry and the tram.
So what happens if they don't? Does it go back to another private person
We're back
for you
to
guys?
we're back to finding out why and taking that into why Sharpview isn't a worthy candidate, and we'll be back to a third-party market avenue.
So there's no chance to go back to a full-time opportunity for the authority to come in first?
So I think that if we wanted to talk about potentialities, maybe that's a potentiality, but I think that the issue boils down to, again, is the difference between value and control. It's going to be very difficult to balance both of those out. I mean, it's been pretty clear that the assumptions that were made about value were just not the correct assumptions. So eventuality, maybe. I think that, frankly, the reason why I think the Mitchells are willing to continue to grant the money for the authority's existence is it's the ultimate hedge for the island. They still care about this place. It's their legacy. They're not burning and going. But what happens if this turns into a big, crazy crash and burn? I would suggest some of the protagonists that are after the Mitchells to prevent all of this, they're pursuing an unhedged strategy. They've got to go 5 for 5, and I don't like their facts. I think our facts are better on all 5. If all that just crashes and burns, well, you've got the authority legislation in place. That's the ultimate hedge for the Mitchells. Not for the Mitchells, but that's the ultimate hedge for the island. I don't think we're going to get there. I don't know today what objections there would be in terms of Sharpview being a worthy candidate vis-a-vis what's transpired at the Utilities Commission with other private equity buyers for utility assets across the state. But maybe, Kevin, I don't know.
And so what would you place the percentage on likelihood of approval, like 90, higher?
If it's done on, if it's focused on the facts, I think it's going to get approved.
Okay.
Yeah, if it becomes some emotional cascade of noise and nonsense, I think it gets approved, but maybe not by as a big a majority.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Richard? Please state your name and your address on the island.
Thank you, Alan. Dick Johnston, 32 Cape Fear Trail, been here 25 years, property owner, and this will be quick, but I'd just like to confirm, I guess, Alan's comment that we would like to focus completely on going forward, and we all have views of how we got here, but I don't think that's really going to be helpful now. One, whether it's a question or a comment, I guess I've heard this, I'd heard some discussion before, the possibility of the Transportation Authority being involved in operation, whether it's lease or otherwise, and I can understand the NDA restrictions and certainly don't want to get into that muck, but I would state an opinion that hopefully the constituencies of transportation service, certainly including the property owners, would be able, as soon as more information might be available of that alternative, if it is a serious one, might be able to have some time and a way to voice an opinion on that. Not saying it should be another referendum or anything, but to reflect that, I think, very valid input, because this would be another critical step in the ongoing success. So thank you very much for the session.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, we have another questioner. Please come forth. Again, please state your name and your address on the island.
Okay, my name is Tippy Antalik, and we live at 593 Kennekeet Way. My question is for Lee. I understand. Do you have any plan, I'm a full-time resident, so this is my husband. Do you have any plans of cutting back on the schedule, say, during the winter months? I mean, I understand if you would, but are there any plans for that?
I think what Chad said about the possibility of a 45-minute schedule is the most conversation that we've had about that. I mean, I think more broadly, it's an operational decision, but there's a tension between supporting a bunch of ferries that are running with 6 people
Right.
on them, and then having to add ferries, you know, on 4th of July weekend. I think that's just continued operational iteration. But if what's behind your question is a suspicion that what we're counting on to make our numbers work is a dramatic reduction in service, the answer is no.
Okay, that's what I was getting. Also, okay. Are you still going to offer residents the block tickets that we get a little bit of reduction in price?
Yeah, so both of those questions, schedule,
Yeah.
as well as tariff and the ticket classes, that all goes to the Utilities Commission. So we can't change pricing, we can't change the number of different tariffs we have, so the bulk 40, the bulk 80s, we can't do any of that without going to the Utilities Commission. Same thing with changing schedule, we have to go to the Utilities Commission. We did change schedule, Scott, back maybe 10 years ago during the Great Recession. It just so happened that I would be on the half-hour contractor boat at 7:30 at night, and it's pretty much $700 round trip cost.
Yeah.
And every single night in February, I was on that boat, and it was just myself and Robert Norton. And it dawned on me, and I went to the club, and I went to the village and said, look, this is just crushing your rate base. This is going to be a big deal. Rates are going to go up dramatically to try to basically have Robert and I be the only ones on that boat with the crew. We didn't have a rate case. We basically got all the constituents involved and said, look, let's have the contractor schedule run seasonally, not the same throughout the year. And we tied it to daylight savings time, which was the village construction time, and that's how we dealt with that, to basically keep rates low, to keep the rate base off. But we had to go to the Utilities Commission, but we didn't have a rate case then. But anything regarding tariff, ticket classes, fares, or major changes in the schedule, that's a full-on rate case.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone else here? I see a hand in the back. Please come forward and come to the podium.
My name is Andrew Aronson. I'm at 656 Kennekeet, and this is Andrew Aronson. My address 656 Kennekeet. We've been an owner since 2010. My question is, do you foresee any different classes and people who ride the boat, like homeowners versus renters or visitors, and the amount of boxes or luggage or things that they can bring onto the boat? The recent restriction down to 3 items that you can check in has caused a lot of people to bring suitcases and golf clubs and things on the boat. It makes it very crowded and very difficult on a crowded boat anyway. So I was wondering if there might be a leeway or a special pass that homeowners can have who live here and people who stay here for months at a time to be able to bring a little bit more than 3 items.
I think it's the same answer, right? It has to go back through
Goes
the
right.
Utilities Commission.
So let's I think that what we've looked at is the hard part is I think that what the Mitchells helped create here is wonderful, but it is an island. That's the hard part. We have been unable to find any other passenger ferry system, regular or unregulated, that has 3 bags per ticketed passenger plus a carry-on. So that was one benchmark we've had. The issue with the ferry and the tram is, remember, it's public transportation. As much as the Mitchells would have loved to have created a ferry ticket class for just homeowners or just residents, Utilities Commission's public transportation, no preference. And that would also be the same for the luggage. So it's just a balance there on how we get it and where we are. Is it a new normal? Is this massive increase in the rental properties, is that going to be here forever? Maybe, don't know. There's a balance there, and I think we're just trying to find the balance. But I think that from a transportation system, 3 bags per ticketed passenger plus a carry-on, I think is eminently reasonable, because the downside of that is the following. You know, we do this all the time. We'll have a group that's going to rent in Lighthouse Landing a 2-bedroom, and they show up with 9 people. And 9 people times 3 bags is 21 pieces of luggage. And then what happens is, you know, how are 9 people staying at Lighthouse Landing? I don't know, but they're staying there. And then they have all that luggage, so they're able to make it. I would also suggest, too, that the homeowners and the long-term property owners that stay here, they're not an issue for transportation. You're not traveling and trying to do all this stuff on the 4th of July. You're doing it in February and March. You know when you can do your stuff, and we're more than accommodative to help out with that kind of thing. So it's a balance there on how we run a regulated business. That's a seasonal bell curve where we can't invest and make the thing work 100% like it's July 4th, because it would be cost prohibitive throughout the year for everybody.
I understand. I would just say that we need to be somewhat cognizant that we don't penalize homeowners and people who buy here for the sake of the renters who are transient. So.
You know, I'd just add that one corollary to that is that the parking, which is not regulated, does have the differential pricing. And there's a move afoot to regulate the parking, and whether that differential pricing would be permitted or the parking to be regulated, I think, is an open question.
Well, that's an interesting thing that you brought up now that you open that, because the parking, there is a preferred parking area that homeowners can purchase, right? But you're limited to the number of spaces that are there, even though those spaces aren't all used at the same time, even on July 4th. Homeowners have a very small window in which to buy that parking if they want to either increase for 2 cars or whatever cars they have. And when you follow the guides that were given by the transportation department and you try to get something done within that window, oftentimes there are no spaces available. So the next question then would become, as you enlarge the parking lots, which you're doing or is being done, is there any plan to enlarge the homeowner section so that all homeowners can have a parking spot? Because the way it is now, you can't. Even during the time, and I know this from personal experience, that tolling within that time period, they were all gone.
Yeah, I'll let Chad answer the question about expanding the current homeowner parking, but the point I was making was that just as the Utilities Commission doesn't allow differential pricing for the ferry tickets by virtue of whether or not you own a home, not clear they would allow the current differential pricing, the different lots that we have now, if parking were to be regulated.
In terms of the annual pass, I think is what you're talking about. So we provide annual passes for premium and annual passes for general. The way that works is the economics, we pretty much open up renewals for annual passes in December, And we historically run that through the end of February. After February, people are like, why can't I prorate? Why can't I prorate? Well, then it becomes uneconomic for them to prorate. So the issue boils down to is the real estate value of the premium lot. It is what it is. We've got basically 400. We do not oversell because I'm not going to be put in a position on July 4th weekend or any time where someone that bought a premium annual pass does not have a parking spot. As it relates to general annual passes, we have 400,000 exits a year in parking over there, plus. I don't think we've had an issue where we could not find a way for a full-time resident or a long-term property owner to get an annual general pass.
Those are available. But
yeah.
Over the years, the discount has gone away on those passes.
So the annual
and so has the proration.
So the prorations were starting to be uneconomic for you all. So I think the issue is I would like, but in terms of pricing, annual pass went up way less than inflation. It was increased one time since 2006, last year. One time. Less than inflation. Same thing with annual general, way less than inflation. Parking rates across the board, all in, have gone up less than inflation in the last 10 years.
Okay. I don't know your economics, but you do.
And we put in new parking software systems. We put in new lots. So again, there's nothing there where the Mitchells, and relative to my conversations with Lee in the Capitol, where we're going to create some kind of giant revenue hockey stick on parking, hasn't happened.
All I'm suggesting is not the hockey stick, just increase the number of spaces as you're including your lot.
I think we can do that in general. I'm not sure we can increase that many more spaces in premium than the 400 we have.
Okay.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience who has questions?
That might be 420 spaces in 420 in premium, 440 in premium.
All right. Again, anyone present here who has questions they would like to ask? Do we have any questions from people who have written in?
Yes, Alan, we have 3 questions that have been submitted during the meeting. The first one is from Chris Webb. Appears to be a question for you, Lee. Clearly, the bulk of the assets in this purchase are the assets of the transportation company, which has been embroiled in conflict since the formation of the Transportation Authority. Now it has come to litigation. Why does Sharpview want to invest millions in this company that is in the middle of yet another conflict where everyone is lawyering up? What is the long-term goal here?
So I'll just go back to what I said at the beginning. We think it's just a very attractive, long-term, stable, cash-flowing set of assets. We don't think that there's a potential for dramatic growth here. I think everyone would agree with that. It's not that kind of investment. It's just a really stable, predictable, attractive investment as it is. And that's what attracted our investor group to to acquire the portfolio and to invest for the long term.
The second question is from Lou Earnhardt. Why should, and Alan, I'm not sure who would answer this question, but why would we have confidence that the village can effectively manage the complicated ferry and transportation system with the current conditions at Public Safety Department, as well as the island package system and post office, which is currently operating at a much reduced level from years past, closed on Saturdays and only open 10 to 3 on weekdays?
That's a true-false question.
False about village, I think, is doing great right now. And the biggest question, the question that is what I heard was, how can the village run the transportation system? And like Lee said earlier, and Chad had said, we've all said, we're not going to be running the transportation system. There's going to be a management group that, after vetting different management groups, and maybe Chad is a management group, that people with experience are going to be running this. And I think what is missed in her question is, why would the village even want to get into this? Same question that Lee just had to answer, and I think it's a matter of accountability in a lot of respects, and in many respects, the village structure that we have right now, we get the calls about problems with the transportation system right now, and we don't even own it. And so we're, I think that we have ourselves set up to be a good connection between the management and running the ferry and the constituents who are calling in with questions.
Okay, thank you. The last question is from Mark Deloso. Why do we have so many parking employees but are short for employees for the ferry terminal? Why do we block off sections of the parking lot instead of just letting people find their spot?
In terms of the parking employees, in terms of the staff there, we're fully staffed. So, why do we fully staff there? Well, the staff is a smaller staff, and it's also a staff that doesn't have to be certified. So, for example, anybody that's on those boats, whether it be a captain or mates, have to go through certain set of certifications that we don't have to worry about in parking. In terms of outfitters and dock hands, very similar. We are very cognizant. Yes, we'd love to hire summer labor to come in. Notwithstanding, I'm not necessarily sure a 21-year-old driving the trams as a sophomore job in college is necessarily the right decision on the island. So I think that's where we treat that with the baggage handlers and others. It may seem like it's easy, but I would suggest it's just like with Peter in the village. People who live in glass houses can't throw stones. In this market environment, Chris McCall's probably right now trying to find people he can hire, right, and work. It's a very difficult environment to do that and maintain, and also as it relates to the ferry and the dock hands, and maintain it with the cost within the rate base. So could we go out and hire more employees? Sure. We're going to have to go ahead and raise tons of salaries to compete with whatever we got to compete to get the jobs. And I would suggest that's going to increase fares and rates if this is not a new normal. So that's the only way I can answer that question.
Sorry, the second portion of that is, why do we block off sections of the parking instead of just letting people find their spot?
For a couple reasons. One, there might be a restriping. Two, we will do that in annual premium. We will do that in annual premium so that we can open up some of the grass areas where people can park on the grass. All kinds of reasons on that, but we want to direct that traffic flow. So you will see coning. Sometimes we'll cone off the electric vehicle stations on purpose, because we'll have people that don't have electric vehicles park in the EV stations. We're trying to address that with that new lot that we're building out behind contractor services. That will be a lot that will be 90 feet from the main road. That will be where long-term we will put the electric vehicle stations, rather than trying to bring that power, 900 feet underneath everything. We can go 90 feet. But we do block that off for all kinds of reasons, but it's primarily maintain the traffic flow and create the space for the high traffic weekends. Most of the time when you see that, we're restriping, we're doing some repairs, or it's a heavy holiday weekend, and we've got to make sure that we can have enough spaces, whether it be for handicaps, as well as others that have purchased their annual premium pass or annual general pass.
Does that complete the questions we've had written in, Carrie? Does anyone on the board have any follow-up questions from the ones we've had? I have just a couple. I want to be sure I know exactly kind of where we're at the moment. And that is, again, the kind of question I asked Peter, and that is, we're here to get information for our members to guide them with regard to whether they should support or oppose the pending transfer from limited to Sharpview. And part of this is, this is my first question, and that is, the Mitchell family, as I understand it, wants to sell. They've been trying for 8 or 9 years, I think, to dispose of their assets. Is there any reason to believe they don't have a right to do that? It's their personal property. I'm just, is there any reason? I want to be sure they have the right to do that. Anybody question that? And the follow-up there, as I understand it, the only offer on the table at the present is Sharpview. The village is interested, as I understand it. Are you able to explain to me, Peter, what is the plan of the village to acquire? That is, what alternative is there out there that the village is interested in making happen? Let our members know, well, this is the alternative we should consider. It's sort of the bird in the hand versus the two in the bush, or whatever it is, whatever the metaphor.
It's kind of a tough one. So in terms of the village stepping in, we're going to buy everything. That was a question at the end. Yeah. So
what's your plan? What is the alternative our members should consider? Sharpview's here. They presented it. All sounds actually pretty good. And the question is, okay, what's the alternative? The Mitchell family wants out. Everybody says they got the right. They sort of have a right. It's been quite a while. And so what alternative do our members, should they consider with regard to everybody loves you, everybody loves the village. There's no doubt about that. Is there a viable alternative out there that they should consider?
I don't see one right now. So I think that we have, I'm going to talk about the NDA for a minute, but in terms of viable alternatives, there's a number of alternatives that within the conversation right now that we're looking at, and we're wide open to that. In terms of somebody else stepping in or some other way that the village would, no, I don't see that right now.
Well, thank you very much, and let me extend on behalf of the board and the BHA my sincere thanks for each and every one of you coming today, and your cooperation is appreciated. The honest, truthful, complete answers, you all were very straightforward and just down to earth, and I just couldn't appreciate it more. But thank you. I think our members have the information that we need, and I appreciate it.
Could I make one comment just in general? I think that this has been dragging on for years. Not the intention right now. It hasn't been the intention ever, I think, for anybody. And so I think right now there is a level of cooperation amongst all parties to try and, we want to get this done.
And I would concur with that with Peter. I don't cringe when Peter calls me and we talk maybe at least every other day. And I think the same thing is there. As it relates to the discussion, this really has been a 35-year discussion. Dick, how many transportation subcommittee stuff has gone on in this island in the last 25 years? Joyce Fulton has a room full of this exact discussion going back 30 years. The issue is we are owned by a dead person's estate. That's the choice. Status quo is not an option. It's a dead person's estate that's liquidating. We need to find an alternative that works for all of us. That's kind of where we're at. But I do want to emphasize there's no animosity with Peter or with Susan or any of that. We're all working the best we can to work together.
Thank you very much, Chad, Lee, Peter, Susan. Really, again, appreciate it. We are adjourned.